March 15, 1947. The Pacific air hung heavy with the scent of wet earth and rot. Deep inside the jungle of Guam, Private First Class Shoichi Yokoi crouched in a narrow bamboo cave, his breath shallow, his body trembling from hunger and fear. For 2 years he had lived like a ghost, feeding on frogs, snails, and the occasional rat, his skin stretched thin over bone, his eyes hollow from endless nights of listening for footsteps that never came. Outside, the jungle hummed with unseen life. But today, another sound broke through, the faint rhythm of human voices, English voices. His heart seized. The Americans, they were here. After all this time, they had come for him. He remembered the leaflets his commander had shown them back in 1944, drawings of Japanese soldiers mutilated, eyes gouged out, bodies hanging from trees. "This is what the American demons do," Lieutenant Ido had said. "Better to die than to surrender." Yokoi had believed him. Every story whispered among the troops reinforced that belief, that Americans were monsters who took pleasure in torture. To be captured was to lose one's soul. Now, those demons were closing in. Yokoi's fingers, stiff and bony, reached for his bayonet, a blade so rusted it barely glinted in the dim light of his cave. He pressed the tip against his stomach. Perhaps it was time to die with honor. The world outside had moved on without him. The Emperor had surrendered, but Yokoi could not. He had vowed never to fall into enemy hands. The laughter grew louder. He could hear boots crushing leaves. There were young voices, confident, relaxed, hunting him like an animal. His pulse roared in his ears. "Mother," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "forgive me, your son will die a soldier." But then, light exploded into his cave. A blinding beam of sunlight pierced the darkness as the bamboo entrance burst open. Yokoi's eyes, unaccustomed to brightness after years in shadow, burned with pain. He raised his bayonet in defense, but his malnourished body failed him. The weapon slipped from his hand and clattered to the stone floor. 2 figures stood framed in sunlight, American Marines. Their uniforms gleamed, impossibly clean against the filth of the cave. Behind them, a local Chamorro guide whispered something in English, pointing toward Yokoi. For a heartbeat, time froze. Yokoi expected the end, a rifle shot, a kick, the searing pain of a blade. Instead, one of the Marines, a tall man whose name tag read Patterson, lowered his weapon. "Holy hell," he muttered softly, eyes wide. "How long has this guy been out here?" Yokoi didn't understand the words, but he recognized the tone. Not hatred, not cruelty, shock, pity. His body collapsed against the wall, bark-cloth clothing falling apart, ribs like bamboo rods. He was naked, starving, and waiting for the strike that would end it all. But the blow never came. Instead, something soft and warm brushed his shoulders. Patterson had taken off his own field jacket and gently wrapped it around Yokoi's frail frame. The fabric smelled faintly of soap and tobacco, civilization itself. For the first time in 2 years, Yokoi felt warmth that wasn't his own. The second Marine, Cruz, knelt beside him, pulling a canteen from his belt. "Easy," Cruz murmured, his voice low and calm. He tilted the canteen toward Yokoi's cracked lips. Cool, clean water filled his mouth. It was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. When Yokoi tried to gulp too fast, Cruz pulled it back. "Slow down, buddy. You'll make yourself sick." Yokoi blinked. The word buddy meant nothing to him, but the kindness did. Patterson reached for his radio, speaking hurriedly into it. Yokoi caught a single Japanese word. "Prisoner." His blood froze. This was the trick, he thought. Kindness before cruelty. That's what torturers do. But then Cruz reached into his pack again and pulled out something small, wrapped in silver foil. He tore it open and held it out, a chocolate bar. Yokoi stared at it in disbelief. It was absurd. Enemy soldiers offering him food. He had been taught that Americans took trophies, not prisoners. He waited for the blow, for the laughter. Instead, Cruz smiled and mimed eating. "Go on. It's okay." With trembling fingers, Yokoi reached out. The chocolate melted on his tongue like sunlight breaking through clouds. Sweetness flooded his senses. For the first time in years, his eyes filled with tears. He wept silently, unable to understand the world anymore. These were not demons. These were men. Patterson sat beside him, careful not to crowd. "Poor bastard," he whispered to Cruz. "How scared must he have been, living in a hole for 2 years?" Yokoi didn't need a translation. The tone alone pierced through years of fear. When the medic arrived, a tall black corpsman named Doc Williams, he immediately knelt and began checking Yokoi's pulse. His hands were firm yet gentle, his eyes kind. He cleaned wounds that had festered for months and injected him with medicine. No anger, no vengeance, just compassion. Yokoi had seen medics before, Japanese ones who treated officers first, leaving enlisted men to die. But this man was different. Williams looked at him not as an enemy, but as a patient. "You're gonna be okay," he said softly. Yokoi didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. "You are safe." When the Marines lifted him onto a stretcher, he braced for pain, for humiliation. Instead, Patterson placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder and said, "Don't worry, buddy. We'll get you home." The jungle receded behind them, the sunlight dazzling and unreal. For 2 years he had lived expecting death at American hands. Now he was being carried to safety by the very men he had been taught to hate. As they carried him toward the waiting jeep, Yokoi turned his head weakly to look back at the cave, a dark hole carved into the earth, his prison and his protector. He realized he was leaving behind not just the jungle, but the last remnant of the lies he had believed. Still, fear clung to him like his tattered skin. Were these gestures genuine, or the calm before the cruelty he had been warned about? The question gnawed at him, even as exhaustion pulled his eyes closed. But just before sleep claimed him, one thought whispered through the haze of fear. If this is a trick, it is a kind one. Shoichi Yokoi awoke. The air smelled of soap and clean linen. For a moment, he thought he was dreaming. The ceiling above him was smooth, white and rectangular, not the woven bamboo of his cave. His hands, once coated in dirt, rested on crisp sheets. He could hear the hum of an electric fan, something he hadn't seen since before the war. A man in a khaki uniform leaned over him, checking his pulse. It was Doc Williams, the American medic who had found him the day before. His deep voice rumbled softly, "Good morning, friend." Yokoi did not understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Gentle, patient, human. He tried to sit up. Pain lanced through his legs. Williams pressed him gently back. "Easy. You're safe now." Safe. The word meant nothing to a soldier of the Emperor. Safety was dishonor. Yet something in Williams's eyes told him that this world, this strange humming room, obeyed a different code. The door opened, and the tall Marine Patterson stepped in. He was clean-shaven, his uniform crisp, his boots shining. The sight of such neatness made Yokoi acutely aware of his own filth and bones. Patterson smiled. "Hey, look who's awake." Yokoi stared, half expecting mockery. None came. Patterson set something on the bedside table, a tin cup filled with broth. He gestured for Yokoi to drink. The warmth slid down his throat, and he nearly cried again. The flavor was mild, but after 2 years of mud water and insects, it tasted like life itself. Outside the window, Guam's jungle shimmered in the morning light, the same jungle that had been his home and his prison. Later that day, Williams returned with a nurse, a young woman with calm eyes and steady hands. Her name tag read Lieutenant Mary Chen. She was Chinese-American, though Yokoi couldn't have known that yet. She smiled politely and changed his bandages. Her touch was clinical but careful. In another life, her family had fled Japanese occupation in Shanghai. She had every reason to despise this man lying. Before her, a soldier who had served the army that once terrorized her homeland. Yet her hands never hesitated. "Let's get you cleaned up," she said, rolling up his sleeve to insert a needle. "You'll feel better soon." Yokoi flinched at the sight of the syringe. He thought of poison, interrogation drugs, the horrors whispered in the caves of Saipan. But the pain was brief, and within moments, a strange calm settled through his veins. "Good," William said, watching the 4 drip. "Antibiotics. He'll live." Yokoi didn't know what the words meant, but he understood the tone again. Assurance. That evening, another figure entered, a man wearing American fatigues but with a Japanese face. Private Yokoi, he said in fluent Japanese, bowing slightly. My name is Sergeant George Nakamura. I'll be your interpreter. Yokoi's mouth fell open. For the first time since 1945, he heard his own language. You speak Japanese? I do, Nakamura said quietly. My family is from California. They were held in camps during the war while I fought for America. So, yes, I understand both sides. The words struck Yokoi like a wave. A Japanese man fighting for the enemy. His world tilted again. Nakamura continued gently. These Americans would like to know if you wish to write to your family. They can send a message through the Red Cross. Yokoi froze. A letter? To his mother? Impossible. I am a prisoner, he said hesitantly. You would allow this? Nakamura's smile was faint but sincere. Because it is right. The Geneva Convention allows it, and because these men believe every soldier, even an enemy, deserves dignity. Dignity. The word felt foreign and fragile. Yokoi's hand trembled as Nakamura handed him paper and pencil. He stared at the blank page for a long time before writing, Honorable Mother, I am alive. I am in American custody on Guam. I am ashamed that I did not die in battle, but the Americans have treated me with unexpected kindness. They give me food, medicine, and air. I do not understand why. Please forgive your unworthy son for surviving. When he finished, tears had smudged the ink. Patterson, standing nearby, rested a hand on his shoulder. That's good, buddy, he said softly. She'll know you're safe. Yokoi didn't understand the words, but somehow he did. 3 weeks passed. His body began to heal, though his soul lagged behind. Then, one humid morning, Nakamura entered with an envelope in hand. From Japan, he said, smiling. Yokoi took it with shaking fingers. His heart hammered as he unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. His mother's. My son, I thought you dead. The neighbors said you would never return. But now you are alive, and I weep with joy. Do not speak of shame. You are my son. That is all that matters. The words blurred through Yokoi's tears. Patterson found him later that day, the letter still clutched in his hand. Good news? He asked. Nakamura translated Yokoi's reply. My mother. She still wants me, even though I surrendered. Patterson smiled. Of course she does. You're her boy. War doesn't change that. For the first time, Yokoi laughed. A weak, cracked sound that startled even himself. That night, under the dim glow of the hospital lamp, he wrote again in his journal, his first real words since capture. I do not understand these Americans. They were supposed to be demons. They treat me as a man. I do not know what to believe anymore. But perhaps the truth is this. Kindness is stronger than fear. He closed the notebook and looked at the window. Outside, the moonlight painted the jungle silver. The same jungle where he had once waited to die now looked peaceful. And for the first time since 1944, Shoichi Yokoi prayed not for death, but for understanding. Yet he could not know that the days ahead would test his heart even further, that the same soldiers who saved him would soon teach him the meaning of humanity itself. Weeks that followed passed in a rhythm of healing. Each morning, Lieutenant Mary Chen brought in a tray of rice porridge and green tea, the soft aroma filling the ward before dawn. She moved quietly, her uniform immaculate, her voice calm. To the American patients she was Lieutenant Mary, but to Yokoi, she was an enigma, a woman whose people had suffered under his own army, yet who now tended his wounds with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible. When she changed his bandages, she would hum softly, old Chinese melodies that drifted through the sterile air. My grandmother used to sing this when I was a girl, she told him one morning, not caring that he didn't understand. She's still in Shanghai. The Japanese soldiers came through our street once. They took our home. Her tone wavered, just slightly, before steadying again. But you are not them. Yokoi lowered his eyes. He didn't need to know the exact words. Her expression said enough. He wanted to speak, to tell her he was sorry. But his English was still broken, his shame too deep. So instead, he bowed his head in silence as she wrapped his arm in fresh gauze, the quietest apology he could offer. By the second month, the ward felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. The Marines came and went, sometimes leaving magazines or photographs by his bed. Doc Williams would drop by in the evenings to check his vitals, teasing him with a friendly grin. "You're putting on weight, Yokoi. Another week, and we'll have to get you a bigger uniform." Yokoi smiled faintly. He was still shy, his English halting but improving. Each night he practiced words from a pocket dictionary Williams had given him. Thank you, friend, chocolate, home. Words that once had no place in war now defined his new world. One evening, Sergeant George Nakamura returned with something that made Yokoi's heart stop, an envelope stamped with red ink from the Red Cross. "From Japan," he said softly. Yokoi's hands shook as he tore it open. The smell of old paper rose like a memory. Inside was his mother's handwriting, thin, trembling lines that carried the weight of 2 years of grief. "My dear son, I thought you were gone forever. The neighbors said you must have died bravely, and I tried to be proud, but I prayed every night that you were still alive. Now the Americans tell me you are safe. My son, it does not matter that you surrendered. You are alive, and that is enough." The letter slipped from his fingers as the tears came. Patterson, sitting nearby, noticed and asked Nakamura, "Good news?" "Yes," Nakamura said, smiling. "His mother still lives. She forgives him." Patterson's voice softened. "Of course she does. Every mother forgives." Yokoi looked up, eyes glistening. "Even shame?" he asked, struggling for the right word. Patterson hesitated, then nodded. "Especially shame." From that day on, the hospital felt different. The walls no longer closed in, the air no longer smelled of fear. Yokoi began to walk short distances down the corridor, leaning on a crutch. Each step was both a victory and a punishment, a reminder of how long he had lived like an animal and how alien kindness still felt. Lieutenant Chen often walked beside him, her steps measured and silent. "You'll go home soon," she said one afternoon. "The war is over. It's time for you to live again." He looked at her, uncertain. "Live again?" She nodded, smiling gently. "Yes. Everyone deserves a second chance, even soldiers." That night, he wrote in his diary, "The Americans are strange people. They fight with fire and steel, yet treat their enemies with compassion. The nurse whose family suffered at our hands brings me food every morning. I cannot understand this kindness. Perhaps this is true honor, to show mercy when one does not have to." Days passed. The jungle outside grew lush with spring rain. Yokoi spent hours by the window, watching the sunlight filter through the palms, trying to imagine the world beyond. One afternoon, a new visitor appeared. Private Tommy O'Brien, a red-headed Marine barely old enough to shave. He carried a small paper bag and an uncertain smile. "Hiya, pal," he said, setting the bag on the table. "Figured you could use a treat." Inside was a small bar of chocolate, the same kind that had saved him once before. Yokoi blinked in disbelief. O'Brien laughed. "My dad fought in France in the last war. Said a German soldier gave him water when he was captured. He told me, if you ever capture someone, remember that. Guess I'm just doing my part." Through Nakamura's translation, Yokoi nodded slowly. "Your father? Good man." "Yeah," O'Brien said. "So's yours, I bet." The two sat quietly for a while, trading halting words and shy smiles. O'Brien showed him a photo, a family of 6 standing in front of a small house in Boston. "That's them," he said proudly. "They write every week." Yokoi hesitated, then pulled from under his pillow his own treasure, his mother's letter. He held it up beside O'Brien's photo, 2 lives that war had nearly torn apart, now connected by something far simpler. Humanity. That night, Yokoi could not sleep. He thought of Patterson's calm strength, Williams's gentle hands, Chen's quiet forgiveness, Nakamura's wisdom, and O'Brien's warmth. 5 Americans, each different, yet united by something he could not name, something deeper than nationality or uniform. He looked at his reflection in the window, at the thin face of a man reborn. "They should hate me," he whispered in Japanese, "but they do not." And somewhere deep inside, the part of him that once wished for death began to want something else, to live well enough to deserve the kindness he'd been shown. A week later, word came that he would soon be repatriated to Japan. As he packed the few things he owned, a folded letter, a chocolate wrapper, and the worn jacket Patterson had given him, He felt torn between relief and sorrow. When he stepped outside the ward for the time, the warm wind swept through the palms, carrying the scent of the Pacific. He turned toward the hospital, where the people who had saved him stood waving goodbye. He bowed deeply, not as a prisoner, not as a soldier, but as a man. But as he boarded the transport truck, one question still lingered in his mind. What kind of enemy shows mercy like this? He didn't yet know that this mercy would change not only his life, but the story of an entire generation. Third month in American care, Private First Class Shoichi Yokoi had regained enough strength to walk unassisted. His body, once skeletal, now bore faint traces of muscle. The hollow look in his eyes had softened, but though his body healed, his mind was still a battlefield, torn between everything he had been taught and everything he now saw before him. Every morning, Sergeant George Nakamura visited him with a notebook and a smile. "Time for your English lesson, Mr. Yokoi," he'd say cheerfully. They sat together under the shade of a palm tree behind the hospital, the humid air thick with the sound of distant waves. "Good morning," Yokoi repeated slowly. "Good," Nakamura said, nodding. "Now, how are you?" Yokoi frowned, searching for the right response. "I am not dead." Nakamura burst out laughing, clapping him on the shoulder. "Close enough." Their laughter drew glances from passing Marines. Some smiled, others frowned, but no one interfered. Nakamura was known for bridging impossible distances, not just of language, but of hatred. In the evenings, Doc Williams sometimes joined them, his large hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. "You're picking it up quick, pal," he'd say, his southern drawl stretching the words. "Maybe I'll make you my assistant." Yokoi grinned shyly. He had never been anyone's equal before, certainly not a black man's. In the Japanese army, class and race dictated everything. Yet Williams, a man who would not even have been served in a Tokyo restaurant, treated him like a colleague. The realization unsettled him at first, and then humbled him. One humid afternoon, a familiar figure appeared at the hospital, Lieutenant Robert Henderson, a Marine officer who had fought across the Pacific. His face bore the weary calm of someone who had seen too much war. He entered Yokoi's room quietly, removing his cap as he approached. "Private Yokoi," he said through Nakamura's translation, "I fought your army for 3 years, at Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. I lost many good men." Yokoi stiffened instinctively, lowering his eyes. Here it comes, he thought. The accusations, the anger. But Henderson surprised him. "You lived in that cave for 2 years, he continued. "You survived on insects, on fear, on lies. That takes courage, a different kind of courage." He paused, his gaze steady. "You are a soldier doing your duty, so was I. The war is over now. You are my enemy no longer." Then, in a gesture that made the air stand still, Henderson extended his hand. Yokoi hesitated. In the Imperial Army, enlisted men never shook hands with officers, certainly not with enemy officers. But Nakamura's eyes urged him forward. Slowly, hesitantly, Yokoi lifted his trembling hand and grasped Henderson's. The American's grip was firm but warm. "When you return home," Henderson said, "tell your people what you saw here. Tell them that honor is not cruelty. Tell them Americans can be kind." Yokoi swallowed hard. "I will tell them," he whispered. From that day on, Yokoi began keeping a diary. Scraps of paper Nakamura helped him gather. The entries were brief, written in shaky Japanese script. Day 5. "Still cannot believe they feed me 3 times a day. No one has struck me." Day 9. "Nurse Chen changed my bandages again. She is Chinese, we hurt her people, yet she treats me like a brother. I do not understand." Day 15. "Patterson brought me cigarettes and showed me a picture of his sweetheart in California. He says after the war he will open a restaurant. He asks what I want to do. I had no answer. I thought I would die in this war." Day 21. Mother's letter arrived. I wept like a child. Nakamura told me, "Hatred serves no one. Mercy is stronger." I begin to believe him. These were the first honest words Yokoi had written in years, words not filtered through military slogans or propaganda. One night, as rain drummed softly on the roof, Patterson and Williams invited him to the recreation tent. There, American soldiers, baseball on a muddy field under lantern light, their laughter echoing into the jungle. Patterson handed him a glove. Want to try? Yokoi looked at the ball, unsure what to do. Patterson mimed the motion. Catch, throw. The first toss hit Yokoi square in the chest, but he laughed, truly laughed, for the first time since his youth. The sound startled even him. You're a natural, Patterson said, grinning. After the game, Williams tuned a radio to a faint broadcast from Tokyo. Japanese music, tinny and distant, but unmistakable. Yokoi froze, tears blurring his vision. It was a song he hadn't heard since before the war, the kind his mother used to hum while hanging laundry in their village. Patterson turned the dial gently. That's for you, buddy. Yokoi bowed his head, overcome. He wanted to tell them what it meant, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sat quietly, the melody washing over him, and whispered, "Thank you." Weeks passed. Yokoi's perception of the world shifted like sand under his feet. The Americans he met, soldiers, medics, nurses, were not demons or conquerors. They were people. They joked, they argued, they missed their homes. He began to realize that the cruelty he had feared had been built on lies, lies crafted by those who needed enemies to survive. One evening, Patterson sat beside him outside the tent, watching the sun sink into the ocean. "You know," Patterson said, "some of our boys still hate your people. I get it. They lost friends to kamikazes and ambushes. But our officers, they tell us we can't fight hate with hate. We got to be better than that." Yokoi nodded slowly. "Better than war?" Patterson smiled. "Yeah, better than war." The two men sat in silence as the sea turned red gold with twilight. For a moment, neither was soldier nor prisoner, just two weary men sharing the same sky. That night, Yokoi added another entry to his diary. "These Americans confuse me. They should hate us. We killed many of them, yet they treat with kindness. I did not show Chinese prisoners such mercy. I am ashamed." Perhaps true strength is not killing one's enemy, but forgiving him. He stared at those words for a long time before blowing out the lamp. The jungle whispered beyond the canvas walls, the same jungle that had once been his tomb. And though he could not name it yet, something inside him had already been reborn. He would soon leave Guam, but not the lessons it had taught him. The order came for his repatriation. The sky over Guam blazed with summer heat. Private First Class Shoichi Yokoi stood in a clean khaki uniform, not a prisoner's rags, but a proper issue the Marines had tailored for him. His shoulders looked broader now, though still fragile. The field jacket Patterson had once draped over him hung folded over his arm like a keepsake. "Ready to go home, buddy?" Patterson asked, smiling. Home. The word made Yokoi's heart twist. Was Japan still home, or had it become something else, a memory lost to ash and rumor? Still, he nodded. Hi, home. The Marines had gathered to see him off. Patterson, Cruz, Williams, Nakamura, even Lieutenant Mary Chen. They stood at the edge of the pier as the transport ship waited in the harbor, its American flag flapping in the warm Pacific breeze. Before Yokoi climbed the gangway, Patterson stepped forward. "Remember what you saw here," he said through Nakamura. "Tell your people, Americans and Japanese don't have to be enemies." Yokoi bowed deeply, the deep, formal bow of reverence and respect. "I will tell them," he replied in halting English. "Americans have honor." Patterson grinned. "That's all I need to hear." Then, breaking military formality, he pulled Yokoi into an embrace. The old soldier froze for a moment, then returned the hug awkwardly, his eyes stinging. "Take care of yourself, buddy," Patterson said, "and say hello to your mother for me." As Yokoi boarded the ship, the Marines raised their hands in farewell. The horn sounded, long, low and mournful, as the ship pulled away from the dock. Guam's green hills faded into the horizon, taking with them the cave that had once been his grave and the strangers who had become his saviors. The voyage lasted 12 days. Each morning, Yokoi stood by the railing, staring at the endless stretch of sea. The waves were hypnotic, each crest and fall reminding him of the shifting tides inside his heart. He was returning to a country no longer understood, carrying a story few would believe, that the so-called demons had fed him chocolate and wrapped him in kindness. At night, he wrote in his diary, "They treated me as human. They healed me, clothed me, gave me back my life. I go home not as the soldier I once was, but as a man who has seen another kind of strength, mercy. When the ship finally reached Yokohama, grey clouds hung low over the ruins of a nation. Bombed-out buildings lined the harbor. The skyline was nothing but smoke and scaffolding. Yet amid the devastation, life persisted. Fishermen hauling nets, children playing barefoot in the rubble, vendors selling rice balls for a few yen. And then, there she was. His mother stood on the pier, a frail woman in a faded kimono, clutching a letter, his letter. When she saw him, her hands flew to her mouth. She took a step, then another, before her knees buckled. "Oka-san!" he cried, running forward. He caught her before she fell, her body trembling in his arms. "I thought you were dead," she sobbed. "I thought the sea had taken you." "The Americans saved me," he whispered. "I do not understand why, but they saved me." They stood like that for a long time. Mother and son reunited among the ruins of war, their tears falling onto the cracked concrete beneath their feet. Life after the war was hard. Food was scarce, jobs scarcer. But American aid had already begun to flow in. Sacks of wheat stamped U.S. Army, crates of penicillin, barrels of powdered milk. General MacArthur's occupation forces were rebuilding Japan, not punishing it. Streets that had once echoed with air raid sirens now buzzed with the sound of reconstruction. Yokoi found work with a construction company in Nagoya, hauling bricks and timber for the rebuilding effort. He married a local seamstress in 1950, and together they built a modest life. He rarely spoke of his years in the jungle or the Americans who found him, but when he did, his eyes softened with memory. "They would have shot me," he told his son once. "I was their enemy. I had tried to kill Americans, but they gave me chocolate instead of bullets. They gave me mercy instead of hate." That is true strength. His children grew up listening to those quiet words, never fully understanding their depth until much later. In 1975, nearly 30 years after his rescue, Yokoi did something extraordinary. He wrote a letter to the U.S. Marine Corps asking for help in locating Corporal Patterson, the man who had found him in the cave. "I wish to thank him properly," he wrote in careful English. 2 months later, a reply arrived. Patterson had survived the war and was now living in Sacramento, California, where he ran a small restaurant, just as he had once dreamed. They began exchanging letters, Christmas cards, photographs, stories of children and grandchildren. Then, in 1977, Yokoi received an invitation. "Come to California. My home is yours." He was 61 when he stepped off the plane in America, his first time back since leaving Guam 3 decades earlier. Patterson was waiting at the terminal, older, heavier, but unmistakably the same man. The two men approached each other slowly, almost shyly. Then, without hesitation, they embraced. "I never forgot you," Yokoi said, his voice breaking. "I never forgot you either, buddy," Patterson replied. For a week, they were inseparable. Patterson introduced him to his wife, his 3 daughters, his restaurant, the Golden Harbor Grill. They shared whiskey in the evenings and pored over old photographs. "You changed my life," Yokoi told him one night. "You showed me that enemies can become friends, that mercy is stronger than revenge." Patterson smiled. "I just treated you like a person." Yokoi shook his head. "No, that is everything." When Yokoi returned to Japan, he carried with him more than memories. He carried proof that the world could heal. His story began appearing in newspapers, in interviews, in history books. Students listened in stunned silence as he told them, "They called me an enemy, but they saved me as a brother. The Americans taught me that honor is not dying for your cause. It is living with compassion for those you once called your foe." As the years passed, his friendship with Patterson became a symbol, a bridge between nations that once sought to destroy each other. And yet, in quiet moments, Yokoi often thought back to that cave on Guam. The cold earth beneath him, the sunlight bursting in, and the voice that said, "Easy, buddy." That was the moment everything had changed. Not just for him, but for how he would understand the world forever. Years rolled onward, their passing as quiet as the tide that once lapped at the shores of Guam. By 1995, Shoichi Yokoi was 79 years old, his hair silver, his back slightly bent from time and toil. Yet his voice, when he spoke, still carried the calm conviction of a man who had walked through darkness and found light. He often said the war had not ended in 1945. For some of us, he told a young reporter, the war ended only when we learned forgiveness. He sat in his small wooden home outside Nagoya, surrounded by potted plants and the laughter of grandchildren, who barely understood the word enemy. On the wall hung 2 photographs, one of his mother, taken the year he returned to Japan, and another of Corporal Patterson, his friend, the man who had once wrapped him in a warm jacket instead of ending his life. Each year, around the date of his rescue, a letter arrived from California, a Christmas card from Patterson, signed simply, "To my brother across the sea." In interviews, Yokoi was often asked what he had learned from the Americans. He would pause, look out the window, and say softly that mercy is not weakness. It is strength, the kind of strength that wins peace, not battles. He told the story countless times, of the moment the sunlight burst into his cave, of the water that touched his lips, of the chocolate that melted on his tongue. But as the years went on, it was the silence of those moments he remembered most, the silence where hatred could have lived but didn't. They could have killed me, he would say. It would have been easy. But they chose compassion. That choice changed the world for me. By the 1970s, Japan had risen from its ashes. Cities glowed with neon light, trains roared beneath mountains, and American tourists filled Tokyo's streets. Yet in that era of prosperity, Yokoi's story struck a different chord. It was no longer about war. It was about the human soul. Students wrote to him, thanking him for teaching them that forgiveness is not surrender, but courage. Veterans visited him, bowing deeply. Even government officials quoted his words in speeches about post-war friendship. Still, Yokoi always credited others. The heroes, he said, were the men who found me: Patterson, Williams, Nakamura, Chen. They fought hate with kindness. I only survived to tell their story. When Patterson passed away in the late 1980s, a final letter arrived in Japan. It was handwritten, shaky, but full of the same warmth. "Shoichi, you once thanked me for treating you like a human being. But I should thank you. You reminded me why we fought, not to destroy enemies, but to prove that decency matters even in the darkest times. You are my friend, always will be." Patterson Yokoi kept that letter folded in his breast pocket until the end of his days. In a 1995 television interview marking 50 years since the end of the war, the host asked him a final question: "Do you still think of the Americans as enemies?" Yokoi smiled gently. "Enemies?" he repeated. "No. The demons were never real. They were stories told by frightened men. The real demons were inside us: fear, pride, hatred. The Americans I met were just men trying to live with honor. When Patterson gave me his jacket, when Doc Williams healed my wounds, when Lieutenant Chen, whose family suffered under our army, treated me with compassion, they showed me something far greater than victory. They showed me humanity." He paused, his eyes glistening. "That day, in that cave, I learned that honor is not dying for your country. It is living with dignity toward others." The studio was silent. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. When Yokoi passed away in 1997, at the age of 81, his family found a small box among his belongings. Inside were the artifacts of a life transformed, the letter from his mother, Patterson's final note, a faded chocolate wrapper, the field jacket that once saved his life. During his funeral, his daughter read out a passage from his diary: "Mercy is not the absence of strength, it is strength restrained. The Americans could have shown vengeance but chose virtue instead. That single act of compassion made me a better man and turned 2 nations from enemies into friends." At that moment, the chapel filled with quiet sobs, not of sorrow, but of understanding. Outside, cherry blossoms fell across the gravestones like pale confetti. Among the mourners were several American veterans who had flown from across the Pacific to pay their respects. They stood side by side with Japanese citizens, united by one man's story. A retired Marine officer stepped forward and placed a folded American flag beside the urn. "He was one of us," the man said softly. "He just wore a different uniform." Today, in museums and classrooms, Shoichi Yokoi's story endures. not as a tale of war, but as a testament to what comes after. Historians cite him as proof that America's decision to treat its enemies with dignity reshaped the post-war world. The Marshall Plan, MacArthur's Reconstruction, the transformation of Japan and Germany, all carried the same seed of belief that mercy could build alliances where vengeance could not. Hatred is easy, revenge is easy, but kindness, especially toward those we are taught to despise, requires the rarest form of courage. In the end, that was Yokoi's final lesson. You do not win peace by conquering your enemies. You win it by turning them into friends. So when you picture him, a frail man crouched in a jungle cave, clutching a bayonet and waiting for death, remember that his story didn't end in fear. It ended in friendship. He found humanity where he expected horror. He found mercy where he expected murder. And in doing so, he proved that even in war's darkest hour, the light of decency can still burn bright enough to change the world.